Our last speaker in the session 2, Ellen Douglas. She's associate professor at the University of Massachusetts Boston, right here. She's a hydrologist and engineer with broad expertise in the analysis of water-related issues. She earned a BS in hydrology and an MS in civil engineering from the University of New Hampshire and a PhD in water resources engineering from Tufts University in 2002. That's why her presentation is How the Specter of Climate Change is Making Us Listen Better and Other Good Outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks. So I've been involved in a number of climate change related projects over the last 10 years or so since I've been at UMass Boston. And I wanted to tell you some of the things that I've learned from those. But first, I always like to start out, or the slide's going to show, okay, about the fact that there really is no question anymore that the climate is changing, and very little uncertainty. We're virtually, almost extremely likely, we're really certain that we as humans and our activities are causing it. And the big reason for that is because we're taking fossil fuels, burning them, and emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And those emissions have increased over time and don't appear to be being reduced at the current level. And why this is a problem is because, you know, we're all carbon-based life forms. For all of you old Star Trek fans, there's carbon everywhere. There's carbon in the ocean, there's carbon in the soils, there's carbon in the atmosphere, there's carbon in trees, there's carbon in us. So carbon is very much a part of the entire planet, and there's this big there's this big carbon cycle. And fossil fuels have been separate from that carbon cycle, buried deep in the earth, and by pulling them out of the earth and emitting this carbon into the atmosphere, we're imbalancing this carbon cycle. We're imbalancing the fluxes and the exchanges of carbon between the ocean and the atmosphere and the land. And we're also increasing the capacity of the atmosphere to warm up. So that's climate change in a nutshell. Obviously, this is a big problem. So what do? Well, we have a lot of different approaches. We could do what are called mitigation effects. We could reduce our emissions. We could improve our efficiency. We could do adaptation efforts, which is more looking to protect from impacts like protective barriers and flood proofing and things like that. We could take institutional efforts, which is creating policies and government action to make some of these things happen. There are social efforts. We could become more educated. We could have more political will to really make a difference and start reducing our impacts. And there's obviously financial and economic solutions as well, such as a carbon tax or pollution fines, things like that. But how do we really make this happen? Well, to put it as one of my favorite country stars says, it takes all kinds of kinds. There's lots of talents, there's lots of expertise, there's lots of roles that each of us can play. It's not just for me as an engineer or scientist, it's not just for a community organizer, it's for all of us to get involved and do our part, whatever that might be, in helping make a solution. It's also, as Christine Figueres, who really is a climate change guru, says, it's a big global problem, but the impacts are local, and in order to solve this, we need to act locally as well. And then you could be like Ellen Douglas and say, yeah, I can do that. When you have an opportunity to get involved, you say, yeah, I can do that, and then figure out how to actually do it later on. So I'm touted as a climate change guru. I'm really not a climate change guru, but I am a climate change communicator. So what I wanted to do is tell you a little bit about the things that I've learned in this process of being involved in climate change research. And one of the big things is to understand that there are many different types of knowledge. As a scientist and an engineer, there wasn't even any question in my head that climate change is a science issue. I mean, it just never even questioned that. But as I got involved in one of the projects in 2008, I started working with a social scientist and anthropologist, and he said, no, climate change is a social issue. And I'm like, what? And so I actually called him the other day and to try to understand what he meant. And to be honest, I'm an engineer. To me, climate change is all about, you know, radiative forcings and engineering solutions, and I didn't really still understand what he means, but the whole point is that there are many views, and the different views on this kind of a topic, and it's not just climate change, but other things, are all valid. So one of the things that I learned is to be open to other viewpoints, because it's amazing what you'll learn when you're open to what other people say. Another thing that I learned by being involved in this process is to be open to the stories. As a scientist, we're trained to be very objective and dispassionate, but that shouldn't keep you, and that's true about looking at data and processes and things like that, but that shouldn't keep you from listening to the stories that people have to tell and the motivations why they're doing what they're doing. Because it's amazing that you'll learn that you're not that different from anybody else, even though your title might be different. And so out of that comes an understanding that we need to respect the knowledge and the priorities of all the different sectors and all the different stakeholders, all the different disciplines, all the different perspectives that are involved when you try to solve a big problem like climate change. And it's amazing when you do that, the commonality that you will find. So the other thing that we learned, I mean, there's a lot of things we learned. You had to tailor it down to a short talk. The other thing we learned in this process is to use the resources that are available to you. So my colleague, Paul Kirshen, who is the big motivator for a lot of the work that has gone on over the last 20 years, have been working on this issue and doing a lot of maps. You may have seen some of the flood maps that we generated over the years. But when Superstorm Sandy came along and hit New York City in 2012 and devastated New York City and missed us, everybody in Boston's like, wow, we dodged a bullet, but we really need to act. So it really got people to accelerate the resiliency and the adaptation efforts going on in Boston. And so Paul's hypothesis, so we had all these agencies in Boston, Massport and Mass DOT and the city, Boston Water and Sewer, et cetera. They all had these resiliency initiatives and adaptation initiatives. And Paul Kirshen's hypothesis was we could bring everybody together and work on a plan together. We can not only meet the objectives of the individual agencies and stakeholders, but we can actually generate co-benefits for everybody as well. Part of the reason we felt that way was because we knew that the agencies were all made up of people who really wanted to do the right thing. And we also felt and believed from the work that we'd already been doing, and that residents that are impacted in Boston by climate change really need to be a part of the process, rather than just a means to an end. And just last week, I was reading a chapter that was written by Ken Reardon, who is the director of our urban planning and community development program here, and it was on some work that he'd done in East St. Louis, and there was a woman there called Ceola Davis who stood when all these experts came in from the university to help them and said, no, you're not going to stand there and tell me what I already know. You're going to stand there and let me tell you what I know and how to help you make this work. So I think it's really important, especially when you're dealing with these kinds of big issues and when you're dealing with a lot of government agencies, to realize that all the stakeholders have a valid part in the process, and residents should be a member of the process as well. So by incorporating the different stakeholders and by exploring the values of the different stakeholders, from government agencies to residents within the community, we found that it actually energizes the process and leads to a better outcome. So I wanted to tell you just a little bit about a project that that Paul Kirshen and many others have been involved in East Boston to develop some climate change adaptation strategies for that community. It started with a couple of projects that were funded by NOAA that we worked, the goal was to work with community residents and environmental justice community. And as an engineer, I'd never even heard of environmental justice, so I was learning as I went. To try to understand how climate change was going to impact these communities and what we as researchers could do to try to help them cope. And then while I was actually on sabbatical in Australia in 2014, Paul and other colleagues developed some workshops in East Boston. The first one was to exchange values amongst all the stakeholders, and then the second was to discuss some plans, potential plans for adaptation. So in East Boston, we had representatives from 3 different neighborhoods. So these were residents who lived and were active and interested in being a part of the process. And then we had representatives from each of the agencies that were going to be involved in some way in developing plans for the community. Brought them together, laid out a big map, showed where the flooding was going to be, listened to presentations from the different stakeholders, gathered in small groups around the table to discuss all of the different options, and came up with a map that showed the locations of the assets within East Boston that were important to the residents and also important to the agencies and the infrastructure people, and ultimately brought in an engineer to try to come up with a conceptual plan for how those assets were going to be protected in a larger sense, such as a flood wall or landscape berms or different kinds of protective strategies, and also to point out the areas within East Boston that were not going to be protected by the larger scale infrastructure and that would need to have some sort of local adaptation like flood proofing and that kind of thing. So to take all of the stakeholder views and perspectives and priorities into account in trying to come up with a plan that would work for East Boston. Now this map actually was a result of the first 2 NOAA funded projects. After that then, so that ended in around 2014. Since then, so 2015, 2016, Paul Kirshen and NOAH, which is the Neighborhood of Affordable Housing in East Boston, have gotten a Kresge planning grant to bring together all the government agencies to commit, to actually have a written commitment that they're going to work together and develop these co-benefits and this multi-stakeholder adaptation. And then in 2016, have a Kresge grant to actually to begin implementing this plan. And then most recently, the Coastal Zone Management has actually given the project some money so that they can actually bring the adaptation plan that they worked on to 30% design. So we started with an academic research project, and now we're at the point where we're actually going to bring in engineers. I shouldn't say we, it's mostly Paul and NOAA now at this point, are bringing this in and actually putting stuff on the ground. And I think that's pretty amazing. And this stuff on the ground is going to be designed based on the stakeholder perspectives, views, input from residents all the way up to the city council. So I think that's pretty cool. So what have I learned in working on these climate projects? I've learned a lot of things, but one of the main things is the power of saying, yes, I can. When I started back in 2008, like I said, I didn't even know what environmental justice means. I had never been involved in participatory research. I'm an engineer, I measure water, that's all I knew. I've learned a lot along the way. And of course, again, Christina Figueres, who is the woman who led the entire world to come to an agreement on how to attack climate change just last year, believes in the ingenuity of people saying yes. Also, I learned that, as experts, we need our credentials, we need our competence to get us in the door. But in order to stay there, in order to work on a solution and bring it to fruition, you need to develop the trust and the credibility with the people that you're working with. And then lastly, that no matter who you are, whether you're a community resident, or you're a government agency, or you're a university researcher, we're all in this together, so we really got to work together. And that's all I got to say.
So Ellen, when you were listening to all of those folks in those various groups, what generally came to the fore as a common theme by the people who lived in those communities and wanted you people who were engineers, problem solvers in that way, to hear them, to understand was a major concern?
Well, in East Boston, having many a large proportion of minority communities, one of the things that we heard was a sense of place. One of the options for dealing with climate change is retreat. And that wasn't a popular option because their home is East Boston and they didn't want to leave. And also, in the case of evacuation, they didn't have anywhere to go because all their family and friends were in East Boston as well, so their options were very limited. The other thing we mentioned when we first met with them and talked to them about adaptation options was we mentioned a seawall. And we found out later that we actually caused quite a bit of controversy because they envisioned like this 10-foot, gray concrete wall, which, in East Boston, they have to deal with the airport, they have to deal with the fact that they're kind of separated from the city, they have to deal with a lot of things that they're negative, but the one thing that's really positive is access to the water, and they didn't want that to be blocked. But then we showed them a picture of what's called a modular wall, which is kind of something you build small and build it bigger if you need to, and it completely changed the viewpoint of that kind of an approach.
So understanding that you now know that climate change is a social issue as well as a science issue, and you've described yourself as a communicator, I'm going to ask you in a few seconds to tackle the biggest issue out there, which is, as someone who says at the top of her presentation, there is no doubt now that there is climate change, period. What do you say to get through to somebody who says, I don't believe you?
Well, at this point, I knew you were going to ask me that.
So you're ready.
Well, at this point, so if you're a skeptic, it's okay to be a skeptic. Scientists are skeptic. It's okay to say, I don't know if I believe that. Explain it to me. Tell it to me. Prove it to me. But if you're a denier, it means that you don't really care about the facts anymore, and you really don't care about reality. You have your own views, and that's that. And I have found that when it comes to climate change deniers, that's the stance, and no amount of factual education is going to make a difference. And so my stance is now that those of us who know that it's real are just moving forward despite the noise.
All right. Thank you very much, Ellen Douglas.